Hey, what's up guys, it's Tony here. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. This episode is going to be very Hong Kong heavy. There's a lot of stuff that's come out of Hong Kong this week. Legal stuff, political stuff, economic stuff. It's been a pretty crazy week in the Fragrant Harbour, so this is going to be a Hong Kong heavy episode. If you're watching this for the first time, I'm basically a lawyer by training, but my government sent me to China to study Chinese foreign policy and economics. I now work in an executive role where one of my duties is following economic and policy developments at the macro level in China, writing reports on that in-house and doing some reports for third parties. And on a Friday, I'd sit down with my mates and they'd ask me, hey Tony, what's been going on in China this week? And I'd sort of lay out the big developments that were happening. And they were always really shocked and surprised and interested. And I thought, wow, this is like really important stuff coming out of the world's #2 economy. So basically I started this channel to talk to you guys like it's a Friday night and we're at the bar, and I'm basically telling you guys what I think you should know about China and what's relevant, and a little bit of analysis. So if you dig that, if it's your sort of thing, if you enjoy this episode, I release one of these every week. So maybe consider subscribing if it's your jam. If you don't want to do that, but you sort of dig what I'm doing, you get what we're doing here, it would be a massive, massive help if you smash that like button. I've only been doing this for a few weeks, and for new YouTubers, the algorithm is king, and a like, even just 1 or 2, can be the difference between 20 views and 200 views. So it'd be a massive, massive help. If you appreciate what we're doing here, if you appreciate what I'm doing on this channel, a like would be a big help. Okay, let's jump in with Hong Kong. Okay, first we need to jump into Hong Kong. A lot has been happening. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have been seeing the images and the videos that have been coming out from the street fighting from this week. Polytechnic University has been a big focus for a lot of the reports. There's been hundreds of students that were holed up inside the university and they were having a standoff against the police. As of the filming of this, there's about 100 still on campus. Over 1,000 have either escaped or been arrested. And when I see those images, it just looks like a scene out of a modern version of Les Miserables or something like that. It's really, really insane. We need to take a step back and look at some of the political and legal decisions and developments that happened this week in Hong Kong, because a lot of them are very important. Let's talk first about the decision of the High Court in Hong Kong regarding the ban on face masks. So you might remember a few weeks ago, Carrie Lam, the chief executive of the SAR government, used an old colonial era 1920s emergency ordinance to ban the wearing of face masks, and this agitated a lot of protesters. This decision to rely on this old or archaic instrument was itself quite controversial. This is a old executive power that, like I said, was used during the colonial era, and it actually gives the executive a lot of authority, like for example the suspension of habeas corpus, the detention, indefinite detention of people. Some protesters, however, took it to court, and on Monday the High Court of Hong Kong ruled that this ban was unconstitutional, which was actually a big victory for rule of law and the power of the judiciary to check executive privilege. What's interesting, however, was the response from Beijing on the Tuesday. On Tuesday, the Legislative Affairs Commission of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, essentially the highest legislative body in the People's Republic of China, criticized the decision, saying that the High Court of Hong Kong had no authority or no jurisdiction to rule on this case because it touched on the basic law or the mini constitution. This is a confusing statement because the High Court has been ruling on the mini constitution for the last 22 years since the handover. Why would Beijing say something about this now? This is concerning because it's the first time the central government has criticized a decision of the High Court when acting within the powers of its jurisdiction to interpret the basic law or the mini constitution of Hong Kong, something which it is empowered to do under the one country, two party system, the basic law, which was written up as its mini constitution and according to common law tradition. If Beijing continues to interfere in this way in judicial independence, it could severely undermine rule of law in the territory. Now, on Wednesday, the US Senate passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. This was passed by Congress a few weeks ago, and there's a slight difference between the congressional version and the senatorial version. So this act needs to go to a separate committee. They need to reconcile the two versions. It needs to be checked off by both houses again. Then it goes to the President Trump, and he has 10 days to either sign it into law or veto it. though the president probably does not want to have to deal with this at the moment, as he's trying to get this phase 1 trade agreement across the line, and the Hong Kong situation is really the last thing he wants to deal with. Because of the bipartisan support behind this bill, it would be very, very unlikely that the president would veto it because of the political fallout, especially going into an election year. And even if he did, it looks like it's pretty veto-proof. It seems that the Congress would very easily be able to vote to overturn that veto and put it into law anyway. So what does the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act do? Well, there's a whole bunch of provisions, but the two most important ones are, one, the State Department must verify at least once a year that Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous or sufficiently independent in order for them to maintain their special economic treatment with the US. Without the special treatment, the Hong Kong economy would be in big trouble, and they would simply not be able to enjoy the position they have for decades now as a major financial hub in Asia. A second major feature of this act is it empowers the US government to impose sanctions on individuals who threaten human rights in Hong Kong. Now, Beijing's reaction has been pretty harsh. Beijing has lashed out against Congress and the Senate, saying that the act is hypocritical and evil, and saying there will be harsh repercussions if this is signed into law. A bit of a signal there to Trump, I think. Okay, we also need to talk about the economy in Hong Kong. So we know from last week that Hong Kong has officially gone into a technical recession. All signs point to a deep recession going into 2020. This is not good for a slowing Chinese economy, and it's particularly not good for the Hong Kong economy, which is heavily leveraged. The financial system is leveraged at about 900% of local GDP, and the private sector is leveraged at about 400% of GDP. So this is going to put tremendous strain on the financial system and tremendous strain on the Hong Kong dollar, which is still pegged to the US dollar. I think that it's unlikely that the Hong Kong government is going to be able to defend that peg, and in the case of a deepening recession, you are most probably going to see a financial crash in Hong Kong and a breaking of that peg with the US dollar. This is of course just speculation on my part, but I'm very pessimistic about the medium-term economic future of Hong Kong, and I foresee tremendous instability and volatility in the financial sector going into 2020. Now, one more thing about Hong Kong before we move on. I don't know if you guys remember, a few months ago there was a story about a gentleman from the UK consulate in Hong Kong who went into China and disappeared. It was later found out that he'd been arrested. That story sort of went away for a while, but he was later released and came back to the Hong Kong side, and then later went into hiding. And on Thursday this week, he released some pretty serious accusations. He said that he was actually abducted by security personnel when he reached the mainland, and that they tortured him for several days in order to get information about the consulate and the operations of diplomats and even intelligence officials from the UK. Now, the Chinese ambassador in the UK has actually been summoned over this and has refused the summoning. The Chinese side has hit back, saying that UK are hypocrites, and they deny all these accusations. And the Foreign Ministry spokesperson Gang Shuang said in a statement on Thursday that Mr. Cheng, Simon Cheng, was arrested due to unlawful activities, and that all of his lawful rights were protected while he was in police custody. If these accusations turn out to be true, it would deal a serious blow to Chinese credibility in terms of their treatment of diplomats and respect for diplomatic community and consulate rights around the world. Okay, next guys, we need to talk about two major reports that were released on Capitol Hill over the last 7 or 8 days that are going to have a profound effect, I think, on China-US relations in the short to medium term. First I want to discuss was actually from Thursday, and it's the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations report that looks into accusations of theft from the Chinese side. The report concluded that the US has failed to effectively stop what it sees as a major issue in Chinese stealing research and IP from American universities, from science labs, and from other institutions, and calling for a slew of measures to protect American IP, American laboratories, and American science and innovation. The second report is from a congressional advisory body, and this is from about a week ago, and this is from the China-US Economic and Security Commission. Now, the report is released every year, and it normally introduces a slew of measures that it recommends the Senate take in order to protect the security and economic relationship that the US has with China. One of the most important recommendations that was made seems to be getting a lot of traction and is already being supported by lawmakers on Capitol Hill. This is the recommendation that foreign companies, particularly Chinese foreign companies, be treated the same if they want to be listed on the stock exchange domestically in the US. Now, you see, at the moment, many foreign companies are not held to the same scrutiny that domestic American companies are. I don't think many people are aware of this, but things like auditing requirements, for many foreign companies, they simply don't have to submit themselves to the level of scrutiny that domestic companies do. If you take Alibaba and Amazon, for example, Amazon, the investors have the right to look at the audits of that company. Alibaba, they don't have to show. So there's really an uneven playing field here. The report's concern is that American investors are not being protected against things like fraud or even bankruptcy. The report also had other recommendations like calling Xi Jinping General Secretary as opposed to President, small things like that. But the provision about changing the rules to insist that foreign companies, including Chinese companies, are held to the same standard as American companies is gaining traction and could well become law. Now, this is a big deal because it would require many Chinese companies to open up and provide a lot more evidence of their inner workings than they've historically given, and it could make it harder for them to list on the American stock exchange and thus have access to that large capital market that is the US. Now, speaking of the economic relationship, we need to talk about the trade war update. Now, not much has happened over the last 7 days. If you watched the last episode that I had from last week, I sort of do a bit of a deep dive into what issues are standing between the Phase 1 agreement passing the line. There are two major factors that have not been agreed upon. They still are up in the air. These are whether the US will peel back their tariffs that they already have in place, and two, the exact number of agricultural purchases that the Chinese side agreed to have. Trump administration have said they want 50 billion in agricultural purchases. The Chinese have said 20 billion. Even 20 billion would be difficult to achieve at this point because of a reduction in soybean demand, because of the effect that African swine fever has had on their pork industry. So even though they do need to import meats like porks and other meat products, the fact that they've got such a lower demand for soybeans is going to make that $20 billion target hard enough to reach, let alone 150% more. So how they're going to get to that point, it's hard to say. The other issue, of course, is whether the US will peel back those tariffs, and again, this is also up in the air. The markets still seem to think that there is going to be some sort of agreement before Christmas, but I will keep you updated as we have more developments on the trade war itself. Okay, the Chinese economy continues to slow. There's more and more bad data that's being released, and now there are Chinese think tanks that are joining a chorus of voices from around the world, from the IMF to the World Bank, saying that China is going to see sub 6% growth in 2020, which will make it very, very difficult for China to hit its 2020 and 2022 targets. On the back of that is the central government's decision to reduce the prime lending rate by 5%. This is essentially allowing for more credit and higher leverage in the market. This is not the large stimulus package that some people have been hoping for, but it is yet another example of a policy decision designed to create more credit and to stimulate the economy, to soften that slowdown during a period where the Chinese have said they are trying their best to deleverage. So even though there hasn't been a major stimulus announcement, this is just another pro-stimulus measure in the works. I mean, last week there was a reduction in the minimum deposit requirements that local governments need to invest in infrastructure. Again, increasing credit and increasing leverage at the local level. One of the things that Beijing vowed it wouldn't do. Now, the last story we need to talk about is a Xinjiang story. The New York Times ran a story this week claiming that they had received leaked documents from the central government in China pertaining to the Chinese activities in Xinjiang. If it is a true leak, it would be the largest of its kind that has come out of the Chinese government for decades, and would point to the possibility that there are individuals or groups within the apparatus, the Chinese governmental apparatus, who are not satisfied with the policy that is being implemented on the ground in Xinjiang. As you probably know, there have been reports for months now saying that Beijing is rounding up Uyghurs, Kazakhs and other ethnic minorities, typically Muslim minorities, in the western so-called autonomous region of Xinjiang, which is Mandarin for New Frontier, and putting them in concentration or re-education camps. The numbers vary, with the low estimates at about 100,000 and high estimates at about 3 million. It seems reasonable based on what I've read that the number is probably around 1 million in a region that has about 20 million Uyghurs. These are crazy, crazy high numbers. Now, the Chinese have maintained for months now that what they're doing in Xinjiang is purely focused on counter-terrorism, and is designed for the safety and well-being of local citizens in that part of the country, and that these camps are simply vocational training centers. Now, if these leaked documents are accurate and have come from the central government in China, then that would completely undermine this narrative from Beijing and paint a very, very dark picture of what's going on in Xinjiang. The release of these documents from the New York Times struck a bit of a nerve for Beijing, and their response was swift and pretty rough, and it's worth reading here. Beijing said, this is from Geng Shuang, who was the spokesperson for the foreign ministry. He said, "The New York Times not only shut its eyes and ears to the above-mentioned facts, but even used the clumsy tricks of grafting flowers and twigs to taking out of context and hyping the so-called internal documents to smear and discredit China's anti-terrorism and de-extremism capabilities in Xinjiang." Okay, thank you so much, guys. It was really good to see you. I hope you found some of this stuff interesting. I'm going to go hit the hay. It's like 1 a.m. here. I'll edit this in the morning and chuck it up. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time on China Update. Bye, guys.